Okay, audience, and
Thank you.
this is me.
I got it now.
All right. All right. So if we think back over our lives, each one of us can think of someone that has been life-changing, right? Some moment in life, somebody we've encountered that has changed the course of our lives. Hopefully for the better, but not necessarily. You know, our relationships, our encounters with other people, they change our lives. This happened in a really dramatic way for me. Whenever I was in my early 20s, 21, 22, I was very much politically minded. I was a bit of a social activist. I had a high admiration for the people going to the protests in Washington, D.C. for the Iraq War. I admired the people on the Greenpeace ships chasing the whalers, stuff like that. I was very much excited by ideas of social revolution and ideas about changing the world in ways that I thought were good and important. This naturally drew me to study this man who was the leader of the biggest social change movement or revolution of the 20th century. Martin Luther King ignited and led and gave voice to the civil rights movement. And he's known for saying this. I think this is probably one of his most famous quotes that most people know from school. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And as I started reading through his speeches, and I read his letters, I was curious about what the foundation of his ideology to change the world. What was the catalyst that moved him to want to see social change, social justice in the world? And what I discovered is it wasn't really about a social movement. It wasn't about people as much as it was about God. The God that this man knew, that he preached, that he learned about in his home, that he trusted in from knowing the Bible, was a God who saw all people in the world created equally before him, and a God whose own justice everyone stood equal before. And he saw our institutions and our schools and our government and our country as being unjust, as being against the will of God. So his movement was about proclaiming the truth to the world. Now, I didn't grow up in a Christian home, and I went to public schools. So what I knew about Martin Luther King at that time was basically the extent of the March on Washington, and I knew the I Have a Dream speech. I knew a bit about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and things like affirmative action. I'd heard about, but I didn't know what was behind the movement. I didn't know really who Martin Luther King was. I knew the historical moments that he was in, but the schools never taught me about who Martin Luther King actually was. When I learned about who Martin Luther King was, I was compelled to also find out who his God was. And it drove me to want to know, who this God was that saw people as being equal. The only thing I really knew about Christianity was, the popular or cultural type of Christianity as kind of a archaic mythological sort of dated understanding of the world. I didn't see that it actually had relevance to who we were, to the world that we lived in. But this is something else Martin Luther King said that really affected me deeply. True peace is not merely the absence of some negative force, tension, confusion, or war. It's the presence of some positive force, justice, goodwill, and brotherhood. This simply means that the Christian virtues of love, mercy, and forgiveness should stand at the center of our lives. King was constantly pointing in his work to God. He was pointing us to God, to the God that he saw and wanted us to see. Now, King didn't make me a Christian, but he pointed me to the God that opened my eyes to who he actually was. He pointed me to the God as he truly was, which I didn't know until I encountered King. King moved the people who shared his vision to resist and to speak out peaceably and patiently, and they changed the world in bigger ways than anybody could have imagined. And King did it in the name of Jesus. By pointing us to Jesus as our example. Jesus changed the world. God changed the world without ever having to be the loudest person in the room. Without ever having to fear that the movement would be destroyed without force. King could walk down the street and not fear his own death with rifles pointed at him and bricks being thrown at his head, because he knew that he was standing for something that was bigger than him and bigger than anybody else. King knew that Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you, falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And he knew that as he walked through this world where this country and much of the world had set up a system that kept most people down and a few people on top. He knew that they were going to resist what he was doing. And he knew that the people that had stood for God that came before him had experienced the same thing.
Did God not get made? And how was he here?
God came to make the world better. And he used Martin Luther King to do part of that work, Simon. That's why he was so important to me in my life. And we have the responsibility today to continue his work. Martin Luther King said in the last speech before he died.
Who is Martin Luther?
He's the man I'm talking about. And he said in his last speech before he died that he had been to a mountaintop and seen the future about where America could be, where the world could go, if we only followed the path that he had set to get there. And we're still fighting to enter that promised land. We still live lives apart, separated in many ways. And it's our responsibility today to follow him and to remember who he was. If we separate him from his God, we don't know who Martin Luther King was. And I didn't know who he was until I knew who his God was.
There they are, they're still here.